I went to Syria in 2012. This was during Ramadan, so summer of 2012, embedded with the Free Syrian Army, which had just then liberated not all of Aleppo city, but a quarter of Aleppo known as Bab al-Hadid. I spent about 36 hours in country. I stayed in a town known as Al-Bab, which is about an hour's drive north of Aleppo city, spent the night there, then drove into Aleppo and sort of surveyed what was then, the thing that struck me the most was the garbage had piled up so high. They were almost like barricades. Entire infrastructure just blasted out by aerial bombardment and artillery shelling. The people I stayed with in Al-Bab, the family, in fact, in whose home I was domiciled for 24 hours or so, were since driven out 7 months later by ISIS. Al-Bab is now one of 2 towns in the suburbs of Aleppo that is exclusively controlled by ISIS and has suffered some of the worst atrocities, both by the Army of Terror and by the Assad regime. So when I got there, they had just liberated Al-Bab from Assad. And what the regime would do was it would shell things like the hospital and any kind of local civil services such that people couldn't be treated for wounds, they couldn't receive food, oil supplies, fuel, petrol were running very, very low. And what I was struck by was the indomitable optimism. A lot of the people there spoke English. They had had training as engineers or studied because they wanted to eventually come to the West. At night, even though there were still armed rebels, what was then the Free Syrian Army, at night, a lot of these guys put down their Kalashnikovs and did something remarkable, at least to my sort of untrained Western eyes. They donned white gloves, they picked up garbage bags and brooms and started to clean up all the rubble that was left by the regime bombardment. And I talked to people as young as 14 years old to well into their 30s. And remember, this protest movement, this rebellion was led by the young. The average age, I think, was probably in the early 20s to maybe mid-20s, the local coordination committees. And I said to them, what are you doing? You've become the Free Syrian street cleaners all of a sudden. And they said, well, that's right. That's because for 40 years, to do anything in this country, you had to ask permission, or you had to pay a bribe, or you were living under the yoke of this totalitarian state. And this is the first time that we felt like a free people. And there was no cant, and there was no, I know plenty of people in the West, you tell this to them, and now they've seen the slow motion collapse of Syria through the lens of jihad, and they think, well, of course they'd say that to a Western journalist. But no, this was sincere. And they were all telling me about, some of the other rebel groups and the brigandry and corruption that was taking place. So they were giving evidence against interest. You couldn't help but be stirred by this. It was a very powerful image, even divorced from some of the, retrospective romanticism. So as I said, 7 months later, Al-Bab is now completely lorded over by ISIS. The family I stayed with, the rebel whose house I was in, Abu Ali, was driven out with his family. So that safe house now belongs to some ISIS thug who's using it for God knows what purposes. So for me, it's personal because as a journalist, I saw the degeneration and the decline of what had started as, I think, a very noble cause and now has become this awful calamity. It doesn't even do to describe it as a civil war any longer. There are so many sideshow conflicts. There are so many civil wars taking place.